In the last couple studies, we've briefly surveyed what the Old Testament has to say about the human heart. And we've seen that it does indeed indicate that the heart is where we make decisions. And we're going to continue looking at that today in the book of Matthew. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're trying to answer the question, what is man? And right now we're trying to understand what the heart is. And as I already have indicated here in our introduction, it's not this organ that's pumping blood. It's a spiritual reality, a spiritual place where we're making decisions. This is like an arrow making decisions, this or this. And it's a connection between, I would say, our human brain, but also our spirit and our soul, which are not part of the physical body. They're immaterial parts. And all of these come together. And within that sphere, there's a decision-making, a decision-making element in here. And this is what the heart is. And in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 28, as Jesus is contrasting the law that had been given by Moses, and he's looking at the law of the kingdom and indicating that the law of the kingdom is going to be even more stringent. And he's trying to make this point to these people that really want the kingdom, but they don't necessarily, they need to understand what the righteousness in that kingdom will be like. He, having told them that a person was liable for committing adultery under the law, but in verse 28, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with the intent of lust, this would be the idea, the purpose of lust, for her, has already committed adultery in his heart. Committed adultery is just one word. It'd be the verb adulter, but we don't use that word like that very often. We don't use it as a verb. So committed adultery with her in his heart. In other words, he's made this decision. He's decided in his heart to entertain this idea, to think this way. He's intentionally looking at her to imagine an act of adultery, is what Jesus is getting at. And so then he's going to tell them in the following context that in the kingdom, because even what goes on in the heart they're going to be held accountable for that, not just their physical acts, that a person is going to think about some very rigid, very extreme responses to the cravings of their sin nature so as to avoid judgment. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is telling these same group of people with regard to the kingdom about the difference between we look at their wealth and their material possessions and looking forward to the kingdom that it'll be different. He says, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroys, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. How do you do that? You don't bring money to the church, because this is not about the church. This is about the kingdom. And this is about these Jews, and out of the book of Isaiah and the book of Revelation, both of them indicate that people are going to be bringing their wealth to Jerusalem, and it from there will be carried to the New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. So they bring it to the earthly Jerusalem, and from there to the heavenly Jerusalem. And that's where they're going to store it. People aren't going to store it up here in their pocketbook, go put it in a bank somewhere. There's a number of reasons for it, but one of those things is it makes them then continually dependent on coming to Jerusalem to have access to the things they need. And if they come and they do it right, they're never going to have a need. They'll come because they have these things, they bring their wealth there, and that's where they go in and get it as they have need. So he says, store up your treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there is your heart also. I think most of us understand this part of it, that when we're talking about the things that mean a lot to us, that's where our decider is going, and it makes decisions based on those things where the things that we value most are. If we value people, if we're valuing, just as an example for us, if we're valuing people properly, our decider is going to be making decisions in connection with those people and where they are. If we are making decisions with regard, if our heart is set on, or we value wealth and material things, then our heart is going to be set here on this earth, and it's going to be set on whatever the market is doing, the interest rates, all of these things connect with that. That's where it's going to be. And he says, in the future, in the kingdom, They need to store their treasures up in the right place, and that'll keep them focused in their decision making on the right place rather than down here, which is what he calls them to do. In Matthew chapter 9, we read in verse 2, and they brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. Seeing their faith, that is, and this is the account of the four men that bring their paralytic friend. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralytic, "Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven." And some of the scribes said to themselves, and this is important because this is this pronoun we've talked about, hautois, it's in themselves. It's not among a group. They're saying this potentially here among their very small group, but I think even more so that it's what they're saying, each of them inside. They're reasoning this in themselves, not among their group. This fellow blasphemes. Now, the reason for that is who can forgive sins except God, and they don't think Jesus is God. Verse 4, and Jesus then, knowing their thoughts, said, "Why are you thinking evil in your hearts?" Now, I've highlighted the word thoughts because we talked about thoughts a couple weeks back, and we talked about that those are the things that move through the mind. And this is not that word dianoia. Thoughts here is the word that he uses here, enthumesis, and then enthumomai. And enthumomai, and this is, both of these are talking about the heart of this word. Let me just kind of highlight it if I can in here. The heart of this word is this thumos, and it has to do with this idea of heat. And then it's en, the preposition en. And I would understand it, we'd put it in simple terms, it's what generates heat inside of us. It's what we get excited or enthusiastic about. In fact, we get our word enthusiasm from this, and I think fairly that this is what Jesus is referring to. Things that they're excited about. Things that turn the thermostat up inside them because they get excited about this. Not enthusiastic in a negative way. I think enthusiastic in a positive way. But they're enthusiastic and he says, in their hearts. And he says it's evil. In other words, they're enthusiastic about, we got this guy. We found a chink in his armor. He has blasphemed because he has just laid claim to an ability that only God has, that is to forgive sins. And so they're enthusiastic in an evil way, an evil that spreads to others. And they've made this, they're getting excited about this as they have this thermostat being turned up, this excitement, this enthusiasm in their heart, which is very negative in this case. It's evil. So hopefully you understand. This isn't thoughts and thinking. This is about, it involves thoughts and thinking, but technically this word is talking about what they're enthusiastic about. They're excited about the fact that Jesus made this claim, and they think he's wrong, and now they think that they've got a reason to point a finger at him. And they're doing so in their heart because they're making the decision there. See, they're making this decision about how they're going to relate to this Jesus, what they're going to do with him, how they're going to handle him. In Matthew chapter 15, this is a culmination of a discussion that started earlier where Jesus is confronted by some of the leaders, and they say, "Why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands?" Now, what had happened was that they had developed traditions. The law had washing rituals, but these were traditions that they had developed. And he says, "Why do you violate the traditions of the elders?" And Jesus says, Why do you violate the things of God?" So when he's talking to his disciples, he makes this statement, and let's go back up. Verse 15, Peter said to him, "Explain the parable to us." And Jesus said, "Are you still lacking in understanding? Do you not understand that everything that goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is eliminated?" We all understand biology of eating. Verse 18, "But the things that proceed out of the mouth," the things we say, the words we say, how we talk to people, "that come out from the heart, and those defile the man. For out of the heart comes," he says here in verse 19, "evil thoughts," or reasonings, "and murders, and adulteries, and fornications, and thefts, and false witness, and slanders. These are the things which defile a man, or make a man common. But to eat with unwashed hands, that doesn't defile a man." So he's looking at this list of things that we had here, and he says, see, these are all decisions that we make. They're things that come out of the mouth. They're things that we say. We talk about these things. We get angry and we talk about killing people, and we talk about committing adultery and fornication and things. But it's not just what just comes out of the mouth, but it's also when it comes out of the heart, because we actually make the decision to go ahead and murder, the decision to go ahead and commit adultery, or the decision to go ahead and commit sexual immorality, and so on and so forth. And we do those, and those come from the heart, because we have to decide. We have to choose to act on something that kind of gets us going in a moment in this kind of situation. And this passage, I think, is probably one of the most important ones, because it's showing you that while we think about this, while we use the mind, and while our spirit part of the mind is operative, and then there's things that we feel with regard to the soul, and our body has cravings and all of this, in the end, our heart, when we're done with all this, when we process, we put it all together, it's the union of all these things, thinking about this, thinking through this, that our heart then makes a decision. I will or I won't. I will do this or I won't do this. I'll open my mouth and I will say this thing that is down here, a false witness. And I think it's very interesting. He puts murders, adulteries, fornications first, and thefts, I think, to make the point, false witness and slander, which is what these people kind of are doing as they look at all of this. Those are just as serious as murder, adultery, and fornication. We have a tendency to rate sins and we go, well, those are a lot worse than false witness and slander. Not from God's point of view. They're all equally serious. We need to think very carefully about how we open our mouth and what we say about other people. And this is part of the problem that was going on here when they're saying, you're breaking the traditions. And he says, you're violating God's law. You are violating the things that God has said. That's a lot more serious than breaking traditions. But it all comes out of the heart. Very interesting how we have these really good passages here in Matthew that give us a good illustration of the heart making these decisions, deciding to act like this or to act like this. And I think it's important for us to be able to appreciate that, because every one of us as a believer has a heart. And we have the ability, because we've been saved in the realm of our spirit, to let that spirit have a bearing on this decision-making process so that we can decide in a way that honors God. Now, I think Old Testament people that didn't have that regeneration, they still could make the right decision. Obviously, the people Jesus is talking to in the Sermon on the Mount, they had the ability to make right decisions with their heart. But you and I especially should be able to do it, because we can think with a certain clarity, with a certain perspective and connection to God that they didn't even have. So I encourage us as we think about using our heart. Remember here, not down here. Our heart is we're making decisions. And we'll look more at what the other writers of the New Testament have to say about the idea of heart before we move on. But hopefully you're understanding what the heart is. Just in very simple terms, it's a place where we are thinking through a thing to arrive at a decision, and we make a decision on that. And this is what the heart is. So exercise your heart and choose to relate to who you are in Christ so that you might have a good day in the Lord. And as always, thank you for joining me today.